Hello. So I have been reading this book. I had been reading a lot of philosophy, and I was excited to kind of continue reading some authors and titles that folks mentioned in the comment section. But then this most recent invasion of Ukraine by our buddy Vladimir Putin happened, and so I kind of switched over to history. So I got this book called Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate by M.E. Sarotte, or however you pronounce that. And so I finished that, and I want to move on to my next book, but I thought it was worthwhile talking about this book because it's really good, and I would recommend people read this book if they want to kind of know about just the history behind NATO expansion, and Ukraine, which was just a small piece of that whole situation. And so as I read this book, I kind of expected that it would go from, when the Soviet Union fell apart all the way up to the present time, but it really focused mostly in on, the dissolution of the Soviet Union through George H.W. Bush's presidency, and then what happened during the Clinton presidency. And then that was kind of the end of it, because the author was just looking at that time period and kind of what was happening, what caused all of this. And so, I'll just briefly talk about what was in the book. So it was covered mostly the George Bush Senior administration and their involvement with, Germany when it was still East and West Germany, and they were looking to do a unification of that country. And so obviously NATO was in West Germany, and the Soviet Union had soldiers in East Germany. And so the prime minister of West Germany was working with the Soviet Union to have the withdrawal of troops from East Germany so that they could unify that country. And because the Soviet Union at the time, their economy was just falling apart, they were interested in getting, money to help the situation. And so that was used as a negotiating tool in order for the country to be united and be able to ask for those troops, the Soviet troops, to leave. And so in that whole situation, the USSR was falling apart. Yeltsin was elected as president of Russia, and Gorbachev was the head of the Soviet Union. And so that was all falling apart. And the reason that it was important for the question of NATO was because as they were unifying Germany, would NATO troops be allowed into East Germany, and would NATO be allowed to expand even beyond Germany, east of Germany? And so there was this whole thing going on with United States Secretary of State Baker, who was kind of putting feelers out there. Would you want NATO not to expand 1 inch to the east? What were they looking for? And obviously Russia did not want NATO to expand at all. The foreign minister of West Germany was kind of putting out there, they were so desperate to unite Germany that they were willing to kind of say anything. Would you guys, we promise not to expand NATO east at all. And President Bush was saying, hey, you guys, cease and desist. We are not talking about that. We're not negotiating that. We want to be able to have the option of expanding NATO east if we want to. Russia is in no position economically to be asking for these kinds of things. So they were talking, told Baker, we're not negotiating this point on NATO. And they, talked to Germany and said, no, we need to stop talking about this. And so Germany essentially kind of made a money exchange with Russia so that Russia would, eventually pull their troops out of East Germany, and eventually Germany was united. And they were able to do that with an agreement that allowed them to, eventually that Germany had the right to say whether they would deploy NATO troops to the east, and that also opened up the possibility of other countries joining NATO. And at the time, some of those countries like Poland and Hungary, well, all of them, all of the previous Warsaw Pact countries and stuff, they were desperate to join NATO because they did not want to be under the thumb of what was the Soviet Union and Russia. And so they were asking to become part of NATO. So that agreement was made. And they had a minute at the end where everybody signed also where it said that Germany would be the one that could say whether NATO troops could be deployed or whatever. So that happened. And you have to read the book to understand all the back and forths and all the details about that final treaty that was that allowed Germany to unify and all of that. So then this book goes into the Clinton administration and the whole implementation of NATO expansion and how they were trying to do that so delicately because they didn't want to put a dividing line between Russia and the rest of Europe. They didn't want it to seem like, another like Cold War situation. And so the Clinton administration came up with this thing called, what is it called? The Pentagon also argued against admitting new members until they could be contributors to, rather than consumers of, the security provided by the alliance, the NATO alliance. Instead, it offered an inspired alternative building on the idea of phased expansion, a new partnership for peace. But what happened was there was pushback within the Clinton administration and also from the Republican Party that they didn't want this. They wanted NATO to expand and start admitting countries that were asking, like Poland and Hungary, and and admit those countries first. And so there was enough political pushback that is what happened. And so the author talks at the end of the book about, some of the things that, because what happened in the end was then essentially you end up with this line drawn again, and it's Russia against the rest of Europe. And the author talks about, if they had stuck with the, what is it called again? The Partnership for Peace, and done kind of a slow admission into the group, would that have been better? And would that have not created tensions such that, Russia fell back into authoritarianism or whatever? And she talks about, different things that could have made it better so that Russia might have remained a democracy and maybe integrated with Europe or whatever. But I don't know. My thinking as I was reading this book, even back during the USSR, when Germany was trying to kind of bail out Russia's economy, even the USSR was still intact, they would send money to Gorbachev and it would just disappear, and Gorbachev didn't know where it went. And there was just a lot of, corruption. And then later under Yeltsin, Germany was sending money and the United States was trying to help with that. And they'd get money and it just go to the oligarchs. It would just go away. And so it wouldn't be used for what it was intended to be used for, paying people's paychecks and stuff that they said they desperately needed. And so my feeling is that, Russia really never was a democracy, really. Their economy was never very sound. And I don't know how it could ever, that it was anybody else's fault, that there could have been anything done to help them remain a free market democracy. It just, I think that, the United States worked really hard. I think Europe and Germany worked really hard on the relationship. I think that Russia worked really hard. But in the end, essentially just became an authoritarian government. So yeah, I guess my conclusion after reading this book is that it was hopeful that there could have been this pan-European organization, either outside of NATO, something different from NATO, or within NATO that included Russia, and the countries were, free market democracies and everything was jolly. But I think that probably the fears of countries surrounding Russia were probably right, and their desperation to get into NATO was probably spot on. And that, included Ukraine. The countries that were just bordering Russia, which were, such a delicate issue. And that, it was probably a good idea to get those countries in to NATO as soon as possible, for their own sakes, because I don't think that you can make a country, change its economy, change its government structure. You can't force that unless, you've invaded and occupied the country. And even then, that doesn't always work. And so they're going to do what they're going to do. And it really is too bad. It was a point where you felt like the United States and Europe and Russia were working together to try and make a change, and it just didn't work. And it does make sense to have allies and have a military to be able to protect yourself. So yeah, I definitely recommend reading this book. Now that I'm on a history kick, I also bought a set of other books. Usually I read books kind of in threes, so you can get kind of a well-rounded idea. I didn't with this situation. I just wanted a little bit of information and I wanted to move on. So my next set of books are about the lead up to the Civil War, because for many, many years I've heard people talk about all sorts of different theories about why the United States had a civil war. And so I got 2 of the 3 books. Well, actually, one book is actually 2 volumes called The Road to Disunion, Volume 1 and Volume 2, Secessionists at Bay and Secessionists Triumphant. And then I got this book, which is kind of more of an international eye on the United States lead up to the Civil War, The Cause of All Nations. And then I had another book, which I have written down somewhere that it wasn't in stock. And so I'll get that later. So I'm going to start with reading The Road to Disunion. And then I'll read the other books, and then if there's any gaps in what I'm trying to figure out, then I'll may pick up something else. But yeah, if anybody wants to read along with me, that would be cool. If anybody has read the book Not One Inch, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.